Hey gang, it's me, E.H. Ivins, and this is another edition of the Radical Reset. Well, the COVID-19 virus goes on, and I could comment, but the truth of the matter is, let's be honest, none of us know what the fuck is going on, and it's going to be a while before we know what's really going on, and the Senate has in fact approved a $2 trillion first-round bailout bill, and we're all going to get a check for $1,200 per person, plus $500 for each of our kids. And it's coming. So I could bitch and moan and jump up and down and say how dumb it is and how this is going to cause unintended consequences but not unforeseeable consequences and how this is all going to be a big disaster. But then I would just be another guy bitching on YouTube. And can't do it. Been there, done that, got the t-shirt. I just can't bring myself to do bitching today. So instead, we're going to talk about what I've wanted to talk about all along, because as we're all trapped in our homes and waiting for this to pass and all this other good shit that's going on, let's talk about something that is going to be of interest to us even after this disaster passes. And that is, what are we going to do about the fact that our streets aren't safe and that it's become so routine to have mass murder in this country that it almost goes unnoticed. South Park, actually my favorite TV show, did an episode where there was a school shooting every other day at the school and no one seemed to notice. I don't know if you guys caught that episode, and I love that show. But anyway, it hasn't gotten quite so bad in real life, but it's gotten to the point where, in fact, I was born in Miami Beach, Florida, but I was raised in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and the synagogue that I attended when I was a little boy and lived in Squirrel Hill, which is a Jewish section of Pittsburgh, was the Tree of Life Synagogue, where the shooting took place, the mass murder of Jewish people in Pittsburgh. But Jews are certainly not the only target by a long shot. Black churches, and of course schools, Sandy Hook, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. And people are always searching for, what is the reason for this? What is the reason for this crime? Why are things so out of control? It's, statistically, crime in some ways hasn't gotten worse for quite a while, but in other ways, violent crime has gotten much, much worse. And of course, the number one and easiest thing that people start to talk about when they talk about crime is guns. We need to restrict guns, we need to restrict access to guns. And I want to make clear before I go any further, I do not own a gun. I have never owned a gun. I have no intention of owning a gun. I do not belong to the National Rifle Association. They have not endorsed this podcast. I have 4 children, none of whom, as far as I know, own a gun. None of whom, as far as I know, contemplate getting a gun. Now, I have hunted. My brother-in-law schlepped me, in the coldest winter ever, schlepped me out into the cornfields of Iowa at Christmas time and the frozen stalks to hunt pheasants. But I would just as soon have gone to the grocery store and bought a half a dozen chickens instead of schlepping around to get those half a dozen pheasants, which, by the way, tasted great, but what a pain in the ass, and I've never been so cold in my life, but I digress. But anyway, that all being said, the Second Amendment is the ultimate protection to our democracy, and guns have absolutely nothing to do with why this violent crime has popped up. I understand they're the easy solution. I understand it's the easy thing to talk about. But look, folks, since the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock, this country has been armed to the teeth. Our people have owned guns. There are over 300 million guns in circulation. They were in circulation. And as far as what type of gun, through the 1930s, the mob was shooting each other with Tommy guns. And fully automatic weapons were legal until the 1970s, and the mass murder rate didn't go up. It has nothing to do with the guns. The guns, in fact, are our ultimate protection, because no dictator's life would be worth a plug nickel if they ever tried to take over the United States, because no matter where they looked, there would be a citizen's militia and or individual ready to gun them down. And I know that sounds extreme, but believe me when I tell you, places like Venezuela today and in Cuba, when Castro took over, it would have been nice if the population had been armed so that their dictatorships and the murders that took place would have never happened. Now, all of that said, what does cause crime? And we got to talk about this in the context of what we need to understand. Little statistics here. We need to get into how to understand statistics. And we're going to talk about cause and correlation. What correlates with crime? Guns correlate with crime. In other words, they correlate with murder because they're an easy, quick murder weapon. But in fact, the mass murder rate is higher in Scandinavia, where they use knives. And that's a fact. By the way, Google this and look it up. You don't have to believe every word that comes out of my mouth, but I don't cite a statistic, and I don't cite anything without checking it out first. Now in the book, A Radical Reset, that you can pick up on Amazon, I footnote everything that I say, so you know where to go look to see and verify a claim that I make. But I'm not going to do that in video, podcasts, but just go ahead and check it out. The mass murder rate is worse in countries with knives than it is with guns. So, what is it? If it isn't guns, and by the way, the worst mass murder in U.S. history was done with cow shit. It was the Murrah building in downtown Oklahoma City, where they killed 450 men, women, and children with a van full of cow shit. May Timothy McVeigh rot in hell. I wish I believed in hell, but if there is one, I hope he's rotting in it and burning in it right next to Adolf Hitler and Adolf Eichmann and the rest of those Nazi motherfucker bastards. Okay, but in fact, so what is it? So I have a unique perspective, and the reason I want to talk about crime is because I went to prison. And again, I'm very upfront and open about that, and you can check it out in the preface of A Radical Reset. But that gave me, I'm obviously, an educated person. I'm obviously erudite. I'm obviously able to string words together off the top of my head. I'm obviously educated. But I have a unique perspective in that I've been at the very, very top. I've been a millionaire, but I've also been at the very, very bottom. And that's different than sociology class. And you start to have some real observations. So anyway, through the course of doing this, and when I was in prison, I had a little over 4 years to walk around the same track every single day and think. And I did a lot of things when I was in prison. I wrote a lot of books. A Radical Reset is not the only one. There's another one, a novel called The Grand Master, that's available on Amazon. I'm about to release another one called The Terrarium. And The Grand Master and Terrarium are just enjoyable fiction. They have nothing to do very much, there's everything in life has a little politics in it, but they're not political books per se. And I'm going to release another one called Too Dark for the Devil before too long. And I think you'll find them entertaining. But I digress. This isn't to advertise my books. Here's the thing. I had a lot of time to think. I mean, just hours. That's what prison is. Prison is not like back in the Old West, like cracking rocks, all day long with sledgehammers. Prison, for the most part, is hours and hours and hours and hours of unbelievable boredom. And so as I walked around the track, staying in shape while I was inside, and while I had a lot of time to think, and without the distractions of the internet and a cell phone, and cable TV with lots of channels. I had a little TV, a 13-inch screen, but very restricted access to what we could watch and so on and so forth. I had a lot of time to read and think, and I came up with my 3-step solution. And again, this is in A Radical Reset. I'm going to cover it quickly in the next couple of podcasts, but I have a 3-step solution for how to take crime to near zero and violent crime to near zero in the United States by treating cause, not correlation. So in this podcast, I'm going to talk about part 1 of it, which is drugs. So in my lifetime, let me also disclose fully that I, to this day, enjoy a little medical marijuana. I don't drink because I don't like the taste of alcohol. To me, wine tastes like grape juice spoiled. I just was born without that gene. I have no judgment about it. If you want to drink, drink. Alcohol is by far the most pervasive drug. Alcohol by far is the most destructive drug, which is going to lead to what I'm going to talk about in a little bit, which is the arbitrariness over what's illegal and what's legal. It certainly isn't based on what's bad for you, because alcohol is the worst of them all. When I was in high school, I dropped acid. As an adult, from time to time, I've done ecstasy. And if I had the opportunity and acid were legal, I would do it again. I would not drop ecstasy again because of its current state of illegality. Acid as well, because I don't want to go back to prison. But if they were legal, I would do them both. And I've never tried Molly, but I hear it's a party. I also did some Quaaludes. Now, the reason I share all this with you, first of all, is because I'm far from an addict. I just haven't done them in years and years and years, and I haven't craved them either. And that's the thing. One of the things we have to set in this discussion is that for millions and millions of people, the vast majority of the population, we're not going to become addicted to anything. You could try heroin and you wouldn't become an addict to it. There's nothing magical about any particular drug. If you use them over time, over and over in a short period of time, you risk addiction. But there's no medical reason to become addicted if you try it here and try it there. The reason, in other words, I'm pretty sure I don't want to, but I'm pretty sure I could pick up a cigarette and smoke it right now and put it down, and after I got done hacking and stinking, I don't think I'd smoke another one. I mean, not everyone becomes an addict because they touch an addictive substance. And we have to talk about this as adults, because addiction is often greeted as a disease, but it's not a disease. Bullshit. I was in prison up to my ass in addicts. I was awash in addicts, and in my family, we've had a very close an intimate relationship with addiction that I do share in a radical reset. I'm not going to take the time to do it here, but I have very firsthand, hands-on, complete knowledge of what addiction can and cannot do. So I don't want you to think that I am bereft of feeling for this sort of thing. But the point that I'm going to make in all of this is that not everybody uses a drug and becomes an addict. Most people can use a drug and never touch the thing again, and they can experiment with it and even enjoy it. And since man was coming out of the Olduvai Gorge of Kenya and discovered that certain leaves on certain bushes, if you chewed them or boiled them to make a tea, were hallucinogenic or let you check out, the human race has been checking out on drugs since the dawn of evolution of mankind from ape to Homo sapiens. Okay, it's just that has been a constant. Let's be honest about it. Let's stop pretending that like only those who are infected by the disease get it, because it isn't a disease. What it is the self-medication of self-loathing. It's the unprescribed self-medication of self-loathing. I've known now thousands of addicts from being in prison, and I can tell you not a one of them like themselves. And I feel very, very sorry for them. But what we've done in making drugs illegal is we've turned a health problem and a mental problem into a criminal problem. And that is step one of this entire process. We need to legalize all drugs. Now, drugs do not cause crime, but the high cost of drugs causes crime. In other words, by making, and I'm going to use an example, heroin. Now, I went through my whole life, I've heard about heroin 1,000 times, 1,000,000 times. You've heard about heroin more times than any of us can count. But the fact is, I don't know about you, but I never saw heroin until I went to prison. And I want you to think about that. On the Kingman prison yard, which was the last place I was while I was in prison, I was there for a little over 2 years. I was approached by the prison is broken down, by the way, into racial groups. And the racial group that brings in most of the drugs are what we used to call in prison the paisas, which are the foreign nationals from south of the border, mostly Mexicans, who have been arrested and work for the cartels. And the cartels were always trying to recruit me to do money laundering for them, which of course I wouldn't do because, don't do the crime if you can't do the time. And I don't want to get involved in that, and I think it's immoral. And that's another long discussion. But I got to know them very well. And it's not like on TV where they're these two-dimensional, horrible people. They're very three-dimensional and can be very, very charming. And we had long discussions, and I became an expert on how to distribute drugs across the border, which I'm going to cover in touching in this video. But the point is that heroin would cost 5% of what it does in the street if it were legal. That's a fact. And on the Kingman prison yard, there was lots of heroin. In fact, there was lots of heroin. There was lots of meth. I never saw meth until I went to prison. There was crack cocaine. There was marijuana, and of course, lots of booze and hooch. Most of it, booze and hooch, they made on the yard. But all the drugs were coming in through corrupt prison guards, not up the asses of inmates or their families, like they like to pretend is the case. But really through corrupt prison guards, because they're not being paid very much to do a really shitty job. I mean, the average prison guard's making about $40,000 a year, and it's a fucking miserable way to make a living around miserable fucking people, and they really have a thankless task, and I really don't blame them for taking the money, to be perfectly honest with you. So the drugs are coming in, and in the Kingman yard alone, I can tell you for a fact there's about $3.5 million a year of drugs goes through the yard. So step one in the argument for legalization is if you can't stop it in a prison, you're sure as shit not going to stop it in the street. We've been fighting the war on drugs since 1970s, and Richard Nixon declaring it. I think it was even the late 1960s. And it's not a drug war. It's a drug rout. There's not a chance. We're never going to stop drugs. I knew truck drivers in prison, truck drivers for the cartels who hauled drugs in milk trucks, who were making $1 million a year hauling drugs, the truck drivers. Now, the most highly paid FBI agent doesn't wear, or ATF agent, or DEA agent, or NARC. The best and the brightest are working for the cartels, not for the police. I'm sorry, police, God bless you all. I strongly support the police, but by and large, they're bureaucrats who wear guns. And they're no smarter than the criminals, and really much less smart, because the big money's in the criminal activity, and that's who's attracting the smart people. For example, President Trump's border wall. And I'll just discuss this as one example, and I go into this in much greater detail in a radical reset, and you can go through it. But we're not going to, the reason number one is, we're not going to ever stop the illegal drugs. We need to stop fucking around with it. In other words, instead of running away from the problem, let's lean into it. So, they build the border wall. I'm going to tell you right now, most of the drugs come through tunnels, and there are thousands of them. And the tunnels aren't in the middle of nowhere. I was watching this movie about an assassin. What was it called? It was with Benicio del Toro and Emily Blunt. It was terrific. I forget. But anyway, it was a terrific movie, but the drug tunnel was out in the middle of the fucking desert. In real life, that's not where they are. They're right in the middle of the city because it's easier to hide a tree in the forest than it is to hide it out in the middle of the desert. And there are thousands of them. And there are Mexican families on the other side of the border that are raised to become tunnel diggers. And they only use a tunnel once or twice because they assume that the people that are schlepping the drugs through the tunnel are not trustworthy and will rat out where the tunnel is, and so they're constantly moving tunnels. And they leave them fallow for long periods of time, which is why when you hear a story about they discover a drug tunnel, you might have noticed they never discover anybody in the drug tunnel because they only use them once or twice. And there aren't just a few of them, there are literally thousands of them. Plus, there are Mexican families, Mexican-American families in this country who are part of the cartels who literally raise their children to one day join the Border Patrol, which I'm sorry to tell you is completely infiltrated by corrupt border guards and immigration and naturalization as well, that have been raised from birth as American citizens to go and join these services and work on the border and allow the cartels to bring their stuff across just in trucks. They just know which truck it's going to be, and that immigration and naturalization person is going to be in the border working that day at that gate, and they just wave it through. And they were raised from birth. And they see nothing wrong with it because they're not particularly worried about whether the addict lives or dies. And the addict isn't particularly worried about it because I'm going to tell you another little secret here. Addicts know how dangerous drugs are. Please don't give me the drugs are bad argument. You're right, drugs are bad. Using drugs the way they shouldn't be used is bad. But the fact of the matter is, the addicts know that, and their main goal in life is not longevity. Their main goal in life is getting from point A to point B with the minimum amount of pain. Remember, addiction is the unprescribed medication of self-loathing. These people don't like themselves. They don't care if they live to be 100. All they want to do is get through the day. And they're going to do anything to do it. And if we legalize drugs, all of these cartels, all of these tunnels, all of these illegal crossings, all of the infiltrated border naturalization, all of the infiltrated services and cops and guards all go away because there's no more money in it. And suddenly the price drops. And instead of having to earn hundreds and hundreds of dollars a week, which mostly these people cannot possibly hope to earn to support their habit, they can support it working at McDonald's flipping burgers. And you can flip burgers on heroin. I'm sorry, you can. It's a fact. There are lots of jobs, if we don't price them out by raising the minimum wage too high, which is another discussion for another day, that people can do to support their habit. And it's not believe me, I knew hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them firsthand. This is hands-on experience. They commit the crime to support the habit. Once I saw this debate on TV between a DEA agent and a libertarian, someone who was a lot like me, who said we should legalize drugs, and her argument went, and the libertarian said the prisons are 90% full of people that are there for drug crime, and she said, oh, no, they're not. No, they're not. It's only 36%. Well, that's a case of figures lie and liars figure. Yeah, 36% if you only count possession, use, or sale. But if you consider that, let me tell you something, my friends. Let's all raise our hands. How many of us have been robbed or mugged in our lifetime? Raise your hand. I have. God knows. I've been robbed and mugged. And in fact, I'll tell you where, in San Francisco, I was mugged in a doorway. And there's a 99.9% chance that if your car was broken into, your house was broken into, or you were mugged, or all of the above, it was drug related. And if drugs were legal, it wouldn't have happened. Now ask yourself, would you give a shit about the addict if you knew that you would never be violated that way again? Seriously. I'm not saying that we don't care about our fellow man. I'm saying we free up. For example, in the state of Arizona, we spend $1.1 billion per year on prisons alone. $1.1 billion. We're not a particularly big state. We have one big city in it, Phoenix, and we have one medium-sized city, Tucson, and the rest of the state is wide open. If you flew over Arizona, you'd know what wide open spaces means. And Arizona is not too much different from New Mexico, and not too much different from Colorado, and not too much different from most of the western states. Maybe one big city, like Colorado has Denver, and then a lot of wide open spaces, okay, and a lot of small towns. So we're not particularly populous, but we're still spending $1.1 billion a year. There are three things that states spend money on primarily: prisons, infrastructure like roads, and schools. Think of how much money we're wasting on prisons. We imprison more of our population than any other industrialized nation in the world. And if drugs were legal, the prisons would empty out. And what would happen is we'd have lots of room to do a couple of things that I think we can all agree on. Number one is we could incarcerate people like rapists and pedophiles whose recidivism rate is 100% for life. In other words, today we parole them because we don't have the room for them. But paroling a rapist or paroling a pedophile is very, very foolish because the recidivism rate, which is the fancy word for are they going to do it again, is 100%. These are broken, horrible, monstrous people, and they should be locked up for life. When I was in prison, they used to segregate them because if they were put in the general population, they would be killed by the general population, which, by the way, as far as I'm concerned, would be a public service. And I share with you that I am a victim of pedophilia as a child by my stepfather, so I know what I'm talking about. But they should be locked up for life. But we don't have room for it. But if we emptied out the prisons of addicts who would otherwise not be criminals, in other words, possession, sale, or robbing to support a habit, if a habit was cheap, if heroin would cost what it should really cost, which is 5% of its street cost today, meth would be damn near free. Meth is so easy to make. You need phosphorus, red iodine, and pseudoephedrine. See, I know how to make meth. I learned that in prison too. Isn't that great? And it's super, super cheap to make. And the cost of supporting the habit would go down to nothing. And I'm not saying meth is good. Meth is horrible for you. It makes your teeth rot out and it fucks up your life. But they're going to do it anyway. So the question is, are we going to continue to fight a drug war that we cannot win? Instead, let's empty out the prison, save $800 million a year in Arizona, multiply that times 50 states is you know, what is that, like $40 billion a year? We would save enormous amounts of money that we could redirect to doing something effective, like providing treatment on demand for the addicts that really need it, and treat it as the health problem that it is, and not a criminal problem. We are criminalizing a health problem. That's the problem with the drug war. And it's like an unholy trinity of allies in keeping it illegal. On one hand, you have the church, and when I say the church, religious people in general who say it's immoral. Yes, it is immoral, but the question is, do you really think we should incarcerate these people? Then there's the second group of people who are the people fighting the drug war, and they're just, again, bureaucrats with guns. You cannot ask a bureaucrat whether you should shut down their bureaucracy or to admit that they're ever failing, because all they're ever going to say is, we need more money. It's the same thing like our failing schools. Ask any teacher what's wrong with our schools. The answer is going to be, any public school teacher, not private school teacher. I want to be fair. They're going to say 99.9% of the time we need more money. This despite the fact we spend 5 times as much money today as we did in 1976 when we created the Department of Education. Even adjusted for inflation, and schools have got worse. It's not money, my friends. It's the shitty, lousy school system and the socialization of American public schools. But I digress. Well, the same thing's true in the drug war. We have thrown billions and billions and trillions now of dollars at it, and we haven't even put a dent in it, and we're not going to, because the drug criminals are much smarter than anybody else. So the church, in a weird way, is in bed with the drug enforcers, who are also in bed with the cartels. The last people on earth who want drugs legalized are their cartels. Just like Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, and Bugsy Siegel did not want prohibition to be repealed. They knew that as long as prohibition took place in this country, they made money on alcohol. And the cartels know, and the gangs know, that as long as drugs are illegal, they make the big money. The minute drugs are made legal, the minute a generic producer can produce heroin or meth, and by the way, talk about opiate-related deaths. You know, very, very few people die of prescription opiates. Most people die of poorly cut heroin in the category of opiate-related deaths, something like 80%. And it's poorly cut because it's illegal. If we made it legal, we could make sure that it was properly cut. Cut means diluted. I'm using the drug lord term because, you know, like I've been in prison. Instead of cutting it with fentanyl, we could cut it properly and safely and make sure the doses were proper and make sure the syringes were clean and make sure that HIV wasn't spread into the general population through dirty needles, not to mention Hep C, and it would just, the whole thing would become better. Now, the enemy of good is perfect. And the argument against all of this is that people will be addicted. And people get very emotional on this subject of addiction. And I'm telling you, I have firsthand experience with one of my children with addiction. I do not come at you about this from a place other than firsthand knowledge. I'm not an academic. I'm not a sociologist. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a medical doctor. I have experienced this both in prison and in my family life. And I'm telling you that there is no perfect solution to drugs. We're just not stopping it by making it illegal. If we legalize drugs, everything would change. And suddenly, violent crime would drop precipitously. Why is there violent crime in relation to drugs? because drug trade is an illegal transaction. And in an illegal transaction, you can't go to court. So in other words, if I'm a drug lord and you're a drug pusher and I'm providing you with the product and you fuck me over and don't give me the money that you owe me when you took the product at its wholesale price and you don't pay me back the wholesale price while you go out and retail it, it's just a business transaction. What recourse do I have but to either beat you up or kill you? Because I can't take you to court. You cannot sue in an illegal transaction. Make drugs legal, suddenly we have the judicial system to adjudicate differences between people involved in the drug business. Just like today, a legal marijuana dispensary, if it gets screwed over by one of its employees, or vice versa, the employee wants to sue the dispensary, they can go to court. They don't have to shoot each other. That's why violent crime, if drugs were legal, would plummet, because I'm not part of this, the cartels would not need to kill anybody, which is what, think about it, they have no choice. Cartels don't kill like in the movies because they enjoy it, like some blood-sucking, vampire. They kill because it's their only recourse if fucked in a transaction. It's as simple as that, and that all goes away. The addicts themselves would be better off, and far few would die from improper overdoses because of correct dosage. The spread of disease in the heterosexual population and in the general population, I'm speaking of HIV when I say the heterosexual population, would go way, 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 way down. And we would have enormous amounts of money left over to not just jail the real criminals, the psycho serial killers, rapists, and pedophiles, but also to do the infrastructure work that we've been putting off because, like I said, states do three things, and they spend a shit ton of money on prisons that they shouldn't have. And it's not just the prison system where we would save, like in Arizona, $800 million a year. We could send all the drug cops and all the DEA and shut down all these agencies and save billions and billions and billions and billions of dollars. And again, I know that if you're watching this and you're a drug bureaucrat, you're going to be opposed to this. I know that if you're watching this and you're very, very religious, you're probably going to be opposed to this because you're just going to, but Einstein never said, by the way, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result, but it's just insane anyway. Whether Einstein said it or not, the fact of the matter is, it is insane, and that's what we're doing. We're doing the same thing over and over and over again. We are not putting a dent in this. We are not reducing it. Now, there's one country in the world that didn't legalize all drugs, but decriminalized all drugs. And I, by the way, am not in favor of decriminalization because it replaces one bureaucracy with another. But at least it's a more benign bureaucracy. I'm just opposed to bureaucracy in general because it's all a waste of money. And that, by the way, that country is Portugal. And Portugal decriminalized everything. Decriminalized heroin, decriminalized crack, everything. It's all decriminalized. And what happened in Portugal? Well, for a very short time, addiction went up. And the argument that the anti-drug advocates make is that addiction will go up. And it did go up for a very short period, or drug usage, I should say, went up for a very short period of time because there was a curiosity factor. But when I say a short period of time, less than a year, and then it plummeted. And today there's almost none in Portugal because the cool factor went away. And the addicts got treated and the overdose deaths went to nothing. And in Portugal today, if you're going to be an addict, it's the most healthy place in the world to be an addict. Now, complete legalization would be better still. And the United States could lead the way on this and be civilized about it. Again, I'm not saying let's accept drug addiction. I'm saying let's accept that we're not going to stop it doing what we're doing and treat it instead as a health problem. The same way we did cigarettes and the same way we deal with alcohol today. We're not going to stop people from smoking all cigarettes, and we're not going to stop people from drinking too much alcohol. And by the way, you, of course, have criminal penalties for things that affect other people. In other words, one of the arguments that a libertarian would make is that you're only harming yourself, and then the person opposed to it would say, but look at the family, look at the family. Well, I have a two-part answer to that. Number one is, they're going to harm the family anyway. Believe me, I was in prison with plenty of guys who were addicts, and they didn't give a rat's fuck about their children or wives or anything else. And number two, if we bring it out into the open, and private organizations and charities, and in the states that choose to do so, governmental organizations, we'll discuss that later, want to get involved in the treatment of addiction, and we want to do the education that we've done in the schools, and we want to have the money to do it. We took smoking when I was a kid, and I'm on subject. Smoking is just another drug. Nicotine is just another addictive drug. When I was a kid, everybody smoked. I remember in our house when I was a kid in Pittsburgh, we had little boxes laid out full of loose Kent cigarettes. That was my parents' brand. That people would come into our house to visit with my parents and smoke. The people smoked in their offices, people smoked in movie theaters, people smoked in restaurants, people smoked in bars. The big joke was the non-smoking section on an airplane, because when you put people in a tube, there is no non-smoking section in an airplane, and everybody smoked on airplanes. And then there was a cultural transformation because of education, and smoking went down to where today it is, and it's mostly the only people that smoke are Hollywood celebrities and people of lower education and income status, which is, by the way, why I'm opposed to cigarette taxes, because it's a regressive tax on poor people, but I digress. So anyway, we cut smoking way, way, way down, and we can do the exact same thing with drugs by education. It's the same thing we did with littering. When I was a kid, people used to throw crap out the window all the time. We were guilty of it. Every Christmas time, we would take a trip from Pittsburgh down to Miami Beach to visit my family. And on the road, I can remember throwing bags of McDonald's and shit out the window, and no one gave any thought of it. And then that ad ran of the Indian chief crying on the side of the highway. It's the most transformative experience, in one of the most transformative ads in America, along with Smokey the Bear, okay, and putting out forest fires. And the bottom line is nobody litters anymore. Nobody litters. There's no litter in America, and we change things through education. We have a good track record. It's one of the few successes of the government. We have a good governmental track record in educating people away from addiction. Let's take some of this money that we're not going to spend on prisons and interdiction that it's not only is failing, it's failed, and instead do it for treatment. Not to mention the fact that the gangs go away. I mean, why do gangs exist? And we'll talk about this in the next podcast in much more extent, because this is only part one of my three-step plan. They exist because these fatherless boys need something to do, and how do they make their money? The drug trade. Let's put them out of business. Let's legalize it. Let's bring it out into the open. Let's let private industry and generic producers produce low-cost drugs for the people that want it. Let's spend money in education to persuade people not to want it. Let's treat the addicts that want to be treated and get them well, and those addicts that don't want to get well. This is the last point I'm going to make, then I'm going to wrap it up on this video. We all know lots of functional addicts, don't we? I mean, we all know lots of functional addicts. And the thing of it is that there are functional alcoholics, and there are lots of functional cigarette smokers, and there can be functional heroin addicts and functional meth addicts. In fact, methamphetamine in particular, how it got started, I think it was the Japanese who developed it originally, but we certainly gave it to our bomber pilots in World War II to keep them awake on long bomber runs. It doesn't actually alter your ability to do your job, and in some ways, and I know this is against political correctness and certainly not woke, but in some ways it enhances it. When I was a kid, long-haul truck drivers routinely did speed, which is all methamphetamine is. Crystal meth is just a form of methamphetamine, and there are lots of forms of it. It's just a real cheap form of it. And yeah, it's dangerous, and yeah, it's terrible for you, and that's not the point I'm making. The point I'm making is people can function on it. And we need to live in the real world as the world is. Now, none of this, legalization, is not going to happen as long as, oops, that was me shaking the camera, by the way, guys. This is what happens when my long legs get in the way and I try to cross them and uncross them. Anyway, pardon me. Not very professional, but this is, it's a video podcast. It's not ABC. So anyway, look, none of this is going to happen in a world where there are Democrats and Republicans. This is why anti-politism is so vital. You see, you and I can sit down and have this discussion, and if we were here in person, we could get together and we could debate the pros and cons and come to a reasonable compromise on what we can do to make a real change and legalize, or maybe we compromise and decriminalize drugs in the United States, which would at least be an enormous step in the right direction, and get it done as step one in making our streets safe again. About for today, that's the end of this podcast. Remember to pick up your copy of A Radical Reset on Amazon, whether electronically in download or in the paperback version. Either or, it's fine with me. Be sure to click on the subscribe button. Be sure to click on the notification button. Let's follow, let's join, let's get together. Let's make anti-politism the way things ought and need and will be, and we can do it. And I'll talk about how to accomplish that. I know that a lot of you are saying, yeah, he all sounds great, but this will never happen. It'll happen, because the shit's going to hit the fan, my friends. And suddenly the radical becomes reasonable when the shit hits the fan. Just keep that in mind. Till next we speak. And until then, this is E.H. Ivins, signing off.